Hello and welcome to the Dailies. Today's media coverage was dominated by the fallout from the fatal ICE shooting in Minneapolis, causing a number of changes in President Trump's immigration team amid growing political and legal backlash. We'll also look at America's historic winter storm, rising tensions in the Middle East as Iran continues its deadly protest crackdown. Gaza's fragile next phase also grabbed headlines after the remains of the last Israeli hostage were returned. Federal immigration enforcement remained front and center in America after the fatal shooting of Alex Pretty in Minneapolis sparked nationwide protests, legal challenges, and political backlash. The backlash prompted President Trump to shift tone and deploy a new border official to manage the response. Other big stories also grabbed headlines as a historic winter storm continues to disrupt travel and daily life across much of the country, causing deaths, power outages, and thousands of flight cancellations. We'll start with the backlash after the second ICE killing in Minneapolis. The Washington Times reported that Border Patrol Commander Gregory Bovino is leaving Minneapolis as President Trump reshuffles leadership of his immigration crackdown. Of course, that comes following the fatal shooting of Alex Pretty. The piece also notes that Trump has put border czar Tom Homan in charge, signaling a partial pullback and also softer tone amid mounting backlash. It also highlights legal repercussions as Minnesota officials and cities are now in court seeking to halt the federal surge, arguing it targets sanctuary policies. Newsweek, on the other hand, focused on Homeland Security Secretary Kristi Noem, who is set to testify before the Senate Judiciary Committee on the 3rd of March, amid, of course, backlash over two fatal ICE and Border Patrol shootings in Minneapolis. The report explains that lawmakers are expected to push her and press her on aggressive enforcement tactics as Democrats push an impeachment effort that now has more than 100 co-sponsors. Also, the piece contends newly surfaced video that undercut Department of Homeland Security claims about Alex Pretty's death will probably deepen scrutiny. It adds that some Republicans are also calling for investigations, setting up a tense and highly charged congressional showdown. The Wall Street Journal details how President Trump reversed course in Minneapolis just 48 hours after the fatal shooting of Alex Pretty, as of course video evidence undercut officials' claims and backlash grew from Republicans, gun right allies, and also adversaries. The piece explains that the president, alarmed that the crackdown looked chaotic and not tough, replaced the local Border Patrol commander with border czar Tom Homan and sought to de-escalate tensions. The piece also concludes that the pivot reflects internal divisions over immigration tactics and rising concerns that the episode was becoming a political liability. Of course, this backlash intensified as video evidence revealed details of the shooting. The New York Times conducted a visual investigation using more than a dozen videos to reconstruct the fatal shooting of Alex Pretty in Minneapolis. By synchronizing eyewitnesses and also footage and analyzing it frame by frame, reporters established what they call ground truth, what happened, and also when. Their findings contradicted federal claims that Pretty posed a threat, showing he was holding a phone and appeared restrained before being shot. The investigation highlights how visual evidence can challenge official narratives and help establish accountability. Politico reports that Republicans are increasingly alarmed by ICE shootings in Minneapolis, but are reluctant to confront President Trump directly. The report reveals that lawmakers privately fear the violence is undermining the GOP's strongest campaign issues, immigration and public safety, yet most communicate their concerns in coded language, blaming advisors rather than Trump. The piece shows how GOP leaders quietly push for investigations and softer tactics while avoiding open criticism, hoping the president adjusts course as public backlash and damaging images mount. The Economist explores whether Minnesota can prosecute federal agents over Alex Pritty's killing, despite claims of near-total federal immunity. The analysis explains that agents are shielded by Supremacy Clause immunity, but that protection isn't absolute, as states can still pursue charges if officers acted beyond what was necessary and also proper. The piece cites legal experts who say courts often apply an objective reasonable officer test, meaning accountability remains possible, especially if federal authorities decline to act. The other big story in America is the winter storm that is affecting more than half the population in the U.S. The Washington Post breaks down why Sunday's D.C. storm was far from ordinary, as we can see in those pictures. The analysis says that it wasn't just the snowfall, it was the rare combination of heavy sleet and deep cold. It also explains that several inches of icy pellets fell on top of snow, creating a dense frozen layer with the water content of a much larger blizzard, locking the region in ice for days. Also, the piece explains how Siberian Arctic air collided with Pacific moisture to produce this unusual storm, making it more disruptive and lasting longer probably than a typical winter event. International headlines today were centered on the Middle East after Israel recovered the remains of the last hostage in Gaza, opening the door to the next phase of a fragile ceasefire and the reopening of the Rafah crossing. At the same time, U.S.-Iran tensions are escalating, with Washington deploying an aircraft carrier to the region amid reports of deadly crackdowns on protests. The Guardian reports harrowing testimony from doctors, morgue workers, and also graveyard staff, suggesting Iran's protest death toll may be far higher than official figures, possibly exceeding 30,000. The report recounts how medics describe treating gunshot victims in secret, while witnesses recount bodies moved in refrigerated trucks and buried in mass graves. The piece highlights videos and forensic accounts that point to systematic killings, including close-range shots and deaths during medical care. It also notes internet shutdowns, state concealment continue, leading investigators to say the true scale of the crackdown may never be fully known. Israel Hayom reported that phase 2 of President Trump's Gaza plan has begun following the return of the last hostage, but faces major obstacles, chiefly Hamas's refusal to disarm. The plan calls for demilitarizing Gaza, installing a technocratic civilian administration, reopening Rafah crossing for humanitarian cases, and launching reconstruction. The report notes that Washington is pressing ahead with talks involving Egypt, Qatar, and also Turkey, even as Israel insists Hamas must surrender its weapons before rehabilitation can move forward. The piece also highlights disagreements over governance, security forces, and international deployment, which all underscore how fragile this next phase remains. Haaretz argues that with the return of the last hostage, Israel has effectively closed the Gaza war chapter, but now faces uncomfortable realities. The analysis says that Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu must confront a ceasefire he didn't fully shape, one that leaves Hamas still entrenched and opens the door to Qatar and Turkey's involvement. The piece also argues that while the hostage effort showed Israel's determination, the outcome exposes strategic failures and political fault lines, forcing a reckoning over Gaza's future much sooner than the government expected. And we'll end with Le Monde, which examined the French Parliament's decision to approve a landmark law banning social media access for children under the age of 15 and restricting mobile phone use in high schools as well, with President Macron pushing the measure through on a fast track. The report explains the government's argument that the move is aimed at protecting young people's mental health, but legal experts caution the legislation may indeed conflict with European regulations. It notes platforms will be expected to introduce age verification systems, and some messaging apps and gaming features could be affected, with the implementation planned to begin this September. That's it from us today. Thanks for watching the Dailies, only on Al Arabiya English.